Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to the Artsy Raven. Today, our episode, we'll be speaking with Bruce Allen. But first of all, I'm going to read a bio of Ishimure Michiko because this is a work that he translated recently. So, Ishimure Michiko is regarded as one of Japan's most important modern writers. She published over 50 works, ranging from novels, nonfiction, no drama, and poetry to essays, memoirs, and children's stories. She received numerous international and Japanese literary awards, including the Ramon Magsaysay Award from the Philippines and the Asahi Prize for Literature in Japan. And her best-known work is Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow, or Minamata Disease, which was reprinted over 30 times in Japan and has been translated in English and several other languages. This work, along with several other books focusing on the Minamata disease incident, led her to being known as the mother of the Japanese environmental movement and the Rachel Carlson of Japan. And here with us today is Bruce Allen, and Bruce is a retired professor of translation and global environmental literature at Southern University in Tokyo. His translations include Ishimure Michiko's Lake of Heaven, Japanese Tales of Fantasy and Folklore, and Towards the Paradise of Flowers, a documentary film on Ishimure. He is an editor of Ishimure Michiko's writing in Ecological Perspective Between Sea and Sky, and his translations of several chapters of Spring Castle was recognized by the Kyoto Year-7 Memorial Translation Prize of Cornell University. And today we'll be talking a little bit about Spring Castle. So welcome, Bruce.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about how you got drawn into literary translation.
Okay, sure. Actually, I've taken a rather long and winding path to discovering my vocation as a translator. When I was young, I would never have predicted that I would become a translator. But somehow, slowly and surely, it's happened. And I'm very glad that it did happen. When I was young, I was interested in the sciences, and I did best in sciences and math in high school and such. That was the age of the Sputnik shock of the 1950s and 60s, when America had been shamed by the Russians. We had to catch up. And so American education prioritized the sciences, and I followed in the spirit. Who knows? I might well have gone on to a respectable career in science, maybe become a rocket scientist or perhaps an environmental scientist. But along the way, something happened. I went to a liberal arts college where I was exposed to a wide range of new fields. At the time, it was the age of the upheavals of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the student protest movements, and the student moratorium. And I became exposed to the writings of people like Henry Thoreau, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and such. Also, I had some great teachers who challenged us not to just get an education in order to get a so-called good job, but rather to learn to study so that we might actually change the world for the better. I graduated with a degree in anthropology and sociology, but in the last years at school, I was also taking courses in literature and becoming captured by the world of the arts and literature. When I graduated in 1972, I had no clear idea of what career I would go into. Thinking back on it now, I remember that I almost went to a headhunter to look for a stable job. But instead, I got involved in nonprofit community center for the arts. It was an age of economic security in the US, where many young people like myself could take several years to find themselves doing part-time jobs in the arts. It was an interesting life, and it changed my horizons. But as I was nearing my 30s, I realized I needed a more secure future. In short, I took a contract to teach English language in Tokyo. It was just for 1 year, I thought. But to my great surprise and fortune, soon after arriving, I was asked by 2 universities to teach English literature part-time, since 2 other teachers had suddenly quit. So I started as a mostly untrained English teacher, but and so but I did well enough, and in time I was offered a full-time university tenured position, something that probably could not happen today because of the competition. So for 25 years, I taught English literature, language, and actually medical English at a medical school where I was employed. But along the way, I was getting more involved in literature and especially in environmentally oriented literature. So I went back to graduate school and got a degree in comparative literature. And then in 1994, I entered an energetic new academic society, the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment. This opened a lot of new doors and connections. Soon after, the society held its first international symposium on environmental literature in Hawaii. We invited 2 plenary speakers from Japan, the prize-winning writers Hino Keizo and Ishimure Michiko. They were scheduled to give readings from their recent writings, but they needed English translations. And I was the only native English speaker of the society. And so I was asked to translate chapters from both of the writers' works. I felt woefully unprepared and inadequate for the task, but somehow, I translated these 2 chapters, and that was the start of my literary translation career. After the conference, the society requested me to translate the entire novel by Ishimure, a work titled Lake of Heaven. And well, the thought of translating an entire novel also seemed way beyond my ability, but I accepted the challenge. And part of the reason I accepted the challenge was because I had been captivated by the spirit of Ishimure's speaking and writing and her activism for the environment. And I had the privilege of working closely with her. I hesitate to use the word aura, but I certainly felt this presence when she spoke. She spoke and wrote fundamentally from the oral tradition, something I only vaguely understood at first, but came to wrestle with and appreciate as I translated her work. It forced, or rather allowed me to totally change the way I read and appreciated literature. I learned to become an ear reader and an ear translator, working from the world of sounds and, of course, sight, smell, taste, and other senses. I was and have remained a very slow translator, partly because of the limits of my Japanese proficiency, but also because of the depth of Ishimure's writing. It's filled with the oral tradition of literature. In the oral tradition, there's a very different narrative sense. Ishimure's narrative voice is one that is not just a linear progression from past to future, but a recursive one where events are embedded in the recurring cycles of seasons, nature, and dreams. After translating Lake of Heaven, I went on to co-translate 90 Japanese folk tales from the 12th century collection called the Konjaku Monogatari, or Tales of Ancient Times. And so now, for the past 10 years, I've been translating Ishimure's magnum opus titled Spring Castle, This is a historical novel based on the events of the Shimabara Rebellion that took place some 400 years ago in Kyushu, the southern part of Japan. It was a rebellion of peasants, fishers, and former samurai, most of whom were Japanese Christians. They were responding to conditions of exorbitant taxation, starvation, and religious oppression. The story of the Shimabara highlights an important but largely unknown era of Japanese history, when Japan first internationalized, experimenting with accepting Western culture, religion, its technology of guns, printing press, and such things. At one point, there were perhaps 300,000 Japanese Christian converts out of only 17 million total Japanese population at the time. But in time, the government came to fear, with some valid reasons, that the Christians and their priests represented the vanguard of Western colonialism, and they decided that Christians needed to be prohibited, expelled, or executed. The rebels' defeat in the Shimabara Rebellion in 1638 marked the virtual end of the Christian presence in Japan. It is also it was also the entrance of Japan into the Edo period of about 250 years of mostly isolation from Western countries and culture. A little more about the author. Ishimure came to be known as an environmental writer and activist. She's often called the Rachel Carson of Japan, since both she and Carson wrote best-selling books at the same time that awakened the world to the dangers of industrial pollution. Carson's Silent Spring and Ishimure's book Sorrow in the Sea of Paradise, about the Minamata Disease incident caused by industrial methylmercury poison, led both writers to be heralded as the mothers of the environmental movements in their respective countries. Ishimure went on to write some 50 volumes of work in a wide variety of genres, including poetry, drama, novels, nonfiction essays, children's stories, and memoirs. At this time, I feel it's important to widen Ishimure's reputation as being not just an environmental writer and activist, but to recognize her as one of the leading figures in modern Japanese literature. Spring Castle is Ishimure's magnum opus. It is 600 pages long in Japanese and just under 500 pages in English. My translation, being published by Tuttle Publishing Company, will be released to the public on October 28th. The story is, above all, a soul-wrenching, page-turning story of human love, suffering, and hope. After this, I'd like to read some sections from the story, if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay. I'd like to read a few excerpts from my introduction to the novel Spring Castle to give a little more sense of the historical background and some comments by Ishimure on her reasons for and hopes in writing the novel. On the 15th of April, 1638, an estimated 37,000 Japanese peasant farmers, fishers, and former samurai were executed. On that last day, inside the stone walls of Hara Castle, which is renamed Spring Castle in this novel, the shogun's executioners worked to exhaustion until they had beheaded every last man, woman, and child. The executed were the rebels who had taken part in the Shimabara rebellion and occupied this abandoned castle in making a last stand against oppressive local feudal lords and central government forces. This number of 37,000 people, most of them killed in battle or beheaded on that final day, must stand as a particularly grisly figure in the world's history of warfare. But the complex history behind this figure and event has for the most part remained shrouded in a narrow victor's reporting of events. The tens of thousands, this accounting has almost completely erased the stories of the lives of the tens of thousands, mostly Christian Japanese peasants and a small number of Buddhists and others who joined in the rebellion. The Shimabara Rebellion, also known as the Shimabara Amakusa Rebellion, stemmed from tensions that had been steadily mounting during the 1630s on the Shimabara Peninsula and the nearby Amakusa Islands of Kyushu. The rebels seized the abandoned Hara Castle and hastily refitted it as a fortress from which they could wage their improbable quest, led by a charismatic 15 or 16-year-old boy named Masuda Shiro, hoping to gain freedom and establish a Christian domain within Japan. Their valiant but increasingly desperate occupation of Hara Castle, their spring castle, lasted from December 17, 1637 to April 15, 1638. Spring Castle is Ishimure Michiko's fictional retelling based on extensive historical research of the erased history of the lives, places, and stories of those who organized, took part in, and were defeated in the Shimabara Rebellion. The roots of Ishimure's interest in and compassion for the people of the Shimabara Rebellion lay in the deep ties of her family with local history. She was born on Lower Amakusa Island and raised in the nearby small city of Minamata, just across a bay of the inland Shiranui Sea. She writes, "Only the number of the peasants who died in the uprising has been recorded, but certainly they all had names, and so I gave them names. There were parents, brothers, sisters, and grandparents. But the names of these people, not even one of them remains. And their dead bodies were thrown away like tossing out of tattered rags. I think of myself as a descendant of those who survived. So I thought I needed to give them names. In the novel, I created scenes that showed how those peasants must have brought happiness to the people around them. There's no proof that this has helped to give those souls peace. I don't know what kind of people my ancestors actually were, but I'm connected to this land, and so I couldn't help but think of a requiem for their souls. This was an island where people were sent in exile. Those people would not even tell the islanders their real names. Amakusa was an island of prisoners. And so some of my ancestors too probably were thieves and murderers. None of these exiles and rebels were allowed burial in proper graves that showed their names. In the world's history of punishment, this massacre stands out as an unparalleled incidence of brutal retribution. Ishimure's gradual work on the novel extended over a period of some 50 years. In the 1960s, her experiences as a writer and activist in exposing Minamata Disease incident, which was the world's first recognized case of industrial environmental pollution caused by the discharge of methyl mercury into Minamata Bay by the Chiso Corporation, it brought her to consider more deeply the events that had taken place some 4 centuries earlier in Amakusa and Shimabara. She writes, "My first thoughts of writing this book came to me back at the time when I was protesting at the Tokyo headquarters of the Chiso Corporation, together with the Minamata Disease victims who had been denied government certification. That was on December 6, 1971. The negotiations with Chiso were a difficult struggle, and several days later, we were forced out by the police. After that, we set up tents in front of their head office and continued to negotiate. On a bitterly cold night, we were sleeping by the street together with student supporters, with the falling leaves of the plane trees swirling about and sticking to our cheeks. At the time of our protest, I deeply imagined and sympathized with the situation of the unnamed people who had suffered long ago in Arakaso. And as one last quote from the interview, in an interview she gave near the end of her life, in which she discussed the themes of Spring Castle in relation to her thoughts about writing, beauty, and hope, she reflected, "Our hoping for what we cannot accomplish through human power, our hoping for what is not even possible to be hoped for, this is the essence of our aspiration for beauty. And it is this sense that I've hoped to put into literature. My hope is that at the very end, we may die with aspiration." And for me as a translator, it has been my hope that my translation of Spring Castle will help to introduce this imagination and hope to the readers throughout the world.
Now, Bruce, you actually met Ishimure. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working with them?
Okay. Well, as I said, I met her at a conference, which usually academic conferences tend to be kind of uptight and formal and such, but she had a completely different persona. She really, as I use the word reluctantly, aura, she had a kind of personality that entranced the audience. And I must admit, I had trouble understanding a lot of her circular oral narration. And I later found out that a lot of the Japanese audience too had trouble following it, because she uses a lot of local dialect and ancient language, and her speaking and writing, as I mentioned, are non-linear, more circular, recursive. And so at first, some of us thought, oh, what is her point? Is she going to get back to something that we can settle on? But more and more, we were kind of pulled into her persona and her storytelling ability. And finally, it did come together in a new way that I had never experienced before. So as I say, this not only gave me a kind of new career of translation, but it really shook the way I had thought of reading and literature, to open my ears, open my nose, my senses to literature in a different way from this oral-based tradition.
Now, when you were translating Spring Castle, were there any particularly difficult passages that maybe was hard to translate or hard to, like it really struck you as being really hard to deal with?
Great question. I wanted to get into that. Actually, a lot of people would think of translation as a kind of solitary process, and it can be. But in my case, owing to the difficulty of the text in Japanese, I really needed a lot of help. I got some help from the author herself, but a lot of colleagues helped me over the period of 10 years. So every chapter was read by at least one person, and some people, it took them a whole year to really read through and comment on just one chapter. So it was a 10-year process of learning. And well, again, I'm a rather slow translator, but I think that was appropriate for this text, because by rereading and retranslating, finally I got to understand, I think, the heart of the matter. in Japanese, there's a literary term called kotodama, which means the spirit of language or the spirit of words. And when we first read, we're just reading for meaning or maybe skimming for reading. But if we read really deeply, and that's something that translation allows us to do, reading deeply, rereading, there comes this almost kind of magical point of aha, that's what she wanted to say. And sometimes we later realize that I didn't quite even get it completely right, but there's that repeated experience in translation of going from non-comprehension to be sparked with this feeling of, that's the spirit of the author and the spirit of language and the spirit of place that she was trying to communicate. So yeah, it was a very slow and but cooperative community kind of experience in translating with the help of many people.
Now, Spring Castle took her 50 years to write, and you spent a decade
Correct.
translating it. So, what sustained you over this long journey?
Okay, well, she sustained me, and my friends sustained me. Also, my wife, Japanese wife, helped me with the translation. And it's just one of those things that you get started, and partly it's a stubborn will to see it through to the end. But more than that, it's a continuing enchantment with the work, and it just step by step, you know, uh, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, and then finally finding a publisher and working with a very good editor at Tuttle Publishing and doing final revisions and making it more tight language, and all of those things were huge education, but joy for me to be involved in. So I it was a long process, but I never got tired of it.
Okay. Now, in our present world, there's all these digital distractions and rapid communication. What does Ishimure's oral and sound-based narrative style, do you think it teaches us something about attention, memory, and presence?
Well, I think so. I think so. I think it uh, calls us to back to that age of when literature and arts and music were orally presented, where people listened to stories. If they read deeply. Of course, along the line, uh, the tradition changed from just oral recitation to using a printing press, and so people began to speed up their reading a bit, but still this tradition of oral culture uh, uh, helped people to slow down and read for an hour or two at night if they had time and money to allow that. And of course, that's something that most of us, including myself today, we realize that we're reading volumes, skimming a lot, but rarely going back and reading slowly. Recently, for the first time, I read Brothers Karamazov, and it took me almost 3 months to read that. I had to reread sections over and over, underline, writing my notes to the story. But it was a kind of going back to an older style of reading. And again, translation requires that kind of deep immersion into the story and the literature. But I hope that this kind of reading draws the readers into that kind of reflection and slow reading. To tell the truth, a lot of Japanese readers have found Spring Castle quite deep and slow reading, so that may have limited its popularity to some degree. But I do think there's a place for great novels in the oral tradition. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, or American Indian writers like Leslie Marmon Silko, to say nothing of writers like Faulkner and Melville, and going back to Shakespeare and people like that. There is a place for that. And my publisher tells me, surprisingly, there is a market today for deep books written in that kind of slow traditional style that requires deep immersion into the reading process and the sensual process of being a reader and kind of having a conversation with the text itself.
Now, what do you hope readers in the English-speaking world will take away from Spring Castle? Not just as a story, but as a vision.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, of course, there's this heart-rending episode of Japanese history, which has been largely unreported. Although recently, I understand the American TV series Shogun has touched on some of that same history, the same period 400 years ago, and it's gaining popularity. But this idea of a Christian presence in Japan is quite unknown to most people. As I say, there were a third of a million Japanese Christians at that time, and Western culture was adopted and accepted in Japan to a certain point. But then the threat of it being used as a colonial kind of invasion led them to push back. But then, ironically, later it led to the peaceful period of the Edo period of exclusion. But then, still, the Christian tradition and the printing press and guns and gunpowder, that influence was still in Japan and allowed Japan to modernize very quickly in the 1850s or so when the Meiji Revolution happened. So it's a fascinating period of history. You can get into the economics and political and religious aspects of the story. But again, at the same time, it's a page turner of a novel. It brings tears to many readers' eyes, including mine, even when I reread it a number of times. So its literary merit and also its religious, economic, political history are very important.
Now, has the act of translating Ishimura, has it changed you, like, as a person, do you feel? Like, because you've spent so long working on her projects.
Well, yeah, I mean, among other things, it gained me a new profession as a translator. As I say, I never expected to be a translator. I never aimed for it. But I think translation is an important, what to say, profession or avocation or vocation. It's not, one of those growth uh, professions for lots of young people to go into. But I hope that a lot of people will be inspired to do translation, even and especially in the age of AI translation. AI is obviously getting better job of translation, but anyone who really understands literature will realize that it doesn't have the soul of a great literary writer or translator. So I think there will always, at least for hundreds of years, if I can predict, there will always be the need for translators and for slow readers of this kind of deep literature.
Now, do you have any new projects you're working on, or are you just going to concentrate on teaching from now on?
Well, I'm retired as a teacher now. There's a possibility of doing a new translation from Ishimure's work. The publisher's kind of interested in doing a new translation of her first novel, Paradise on the Sea of Sorrow. That will sort of depend on how well the sales go
Spring
for.
Castle, yeah.
Uh, I'm also working on the possibility of translating a French novel, which also deals with that same period where there was a Japanese young nobleman who was sent to the Vatican and to the kings of Europe to tell about the Japanese Empire. And it's a fascinating story that's written by a French friend of mine, and I'll have to brush up on my French a lot for that. So those are two projects But I still am going through the process of doing PR for Spring Castle, and thanks to you, I'm hoping that this will launch a successful reception when the book goes into public domain on the end of October. I may take a little vacation too. I love hiking in the mountains and doing music and other things like that. But I think I'll get back into translation before too long.
Well, thank you very much for spending time with us here.
Well, great. I'm really inspired by your podcast series and a lot of the other people there. I get the sense that my slow, gradual wandering process of getting into the arts is not so unique. A lot of other people have gone through a lot of those kind of wandering paths. Good in a good way. So keep up the good work, and thank you very much.
Thank you. The Artsy Raven is produced by Dark Helix Press. Introduction voiceover by Chris Gorman. Music by Tim Moore. Please access your bonus content on the Patreon website. Thank you very much for listening, and please stay safe.